Blue Sky, the studio known for making Ice Age, and Ice Age, and Ice Age, and Ice Age, and one or two other things occasionally dotted in there. Okay, that's a bit hyperbolic, but it is kind of crazy that these movies make up nearly half their catalog. I don't know if there is another major theatrical animation studio whose success hinged so entirely on one series they made. Blue Sky is also another first for my reviewing and ranking videos. In this case, they are the first studio I've covered in this series to now be defunct, having been bought out by Disney in 2019 and shut down by them 2 years later. When they existed, I feel like they were often placed into a similar boat as Illumination, usually producing movies that made money but weren't exactly critical darlings and didn't really stay in the cultural zeitgeist for too long after they came out. Now personally, I think Blue Sky has a far better track record than Illumination, if only because Blue Sky at least has a few movies that I especially like, but I understand why the sentiment exists. You may have noticed that this is the shortest one of these I've made so far, even next to my Aardman video, where I talked about a fair amount less movies. It is partially because I intentionally limited how long I gave certain movies, for a reason I'll explain shortly, but it's also largely because the majority of these movies didn't make too strong an impression on me, and therefore I simply don't have that much to say about them. I even forgot about one or two of them when I was originally putting together my watch list for this marathon. I wouldn't be surprised if this video reminds some people that some of these movies even exist. Anyway, to the surprise of absolutely no one, the worst movie ever released by Blue Sky Studios is... number 13. Ice Age: Collision Course. I don't know if there has ever been a more textbook example of what it looks like when a series has simply gone on for way too long. This movie is so bizarre, and there is so much wrong with it that I actually don't know if it's even possible to accurately convey it in a concise manner. This series started off as a simple road trip comedy with only 3 major speaking roles, and it's devolved into a bloated mess of a disaster movie of apocalyptic proportions, and the screen time has to be split between about 85 different characters, despite the vast majority of them having absolutely nothing of relevance to contribute to the plot. And even in the tiny amount of time each of the main characters is given, they are still clearly really struggling to figure out what the hell to even do with them during that time. I mean, for crying out loud, Manny's arc in this movie is pretty much just an exact repeat of his arc from the movie before this one. They bring back Buck, a fan-favorite supporting character from one of the previous movies in this one, and I feel like the movie tries to use him as a crutch. Like, yeah, the movie's a total mess, but at least Buck's here. But they kind of mess up his character by both completely flanderizing him and turning him into a total Mary Sue, so it ultimately fails at even doing that. I'm gonna try and not linger on any of the Ice Age movies for too long, partially because I have to cover 5 of them in this video, and there's inevitably going to be a lot of overlap in what I have to say about them, and partially because I have a wholly separate video where I get into my thoughts on this series in a lot more detail, so you can go watch that if you're interested. Or alternatively, you could wait for the updated version I have in the works. Number 12. Spies in Disguise. This was the last movie to be released by Blue Sky before they were closed, and, I think it would have been nice if they could have gone out on something a bit better. I actually hated Tom Holland's character in this movie. I'm looking back through the notes I took while I was watching it, and every other line is just me ranting about how much Tom Holland's character was pissing me off. I already generally tend to hate characters whose whole personality is just saying a bunch of sciencey sounding buzzwords, so that the other characters can go, huh? In English, please. And this kid in particular is probably the biggest wimp I have ever seen portrayed in film. There was this one bit where Will Smith's character fantasized about murdering him, and I have rarely related to another character more than in that moment. It's not even like the movie's great aside from him. There were like 1 or 2 jokes I found a bit funny. Most of the rest of the humor fell pretty flat for me. I found the villain to be kind of a try-hard lame-o. And Will Smith's character is an idiot who doesn't really seem to understand the secret part of Secret Agent, but this guy alone probably knocked the movie down at least 2 or 3 spots on this list. Number 11. Ice Age: The Continental Drift. A lot of the criticisms I had with Collision Course also apply here, but to a somewhat lesser degree. it's still bloated with way too many characters. A lot of those characters are basically leftovers from the previous movies that don't have anything to contribute to the story anymore. It's still ridiculously far removed from what the series was when it first started out. And this one also has a character who's basically the Ice Age universe equivalent of Tom Holland's character from Spies in Disguise, but compared to what came afterwards, I would say this one is still in almost watchable territory. At least in this one, the main characters of Ice Age actually are the main characters, and there was a bit more of an attempt to give them things to do. Like, okay, Manny's storyline in this movie is a pretty stock rebellious daughter thing where it feels like they're just going through the expected motions, but at least in this movie it wasn't just an exact repeat of an arc he'd already had in a previous movie. I know I'm really scraping the bottom of the barrel for things to praise here. It kind of conveys just how low Collision Course set the bar. Number 10. Epic. Is it even possible for a title to tell you less about what actually happens in a movie? I mean, I guess I can understand why you didn't want to call a blockbuster film The Leaf Men and the Good Brave Bugs, but epic? It's not even an epic. Instead, it's one of the most generic isekai fantasies I've ever seen. The villain, Mr. Meanie McBaddybad, wants to destroy the forest because he's Mr. Meanie McBaddybad, and that's what he does. So Queen Beyonce McGoodygood sends a bland and boring chosen one and a ragtag team of misfits on a quest to protect a MacGuffin and stop him. The protagonist and her kind of love interest are two of the most useless characters of all time. The movie feels like it's intentionally structured around having them not be present whenever anything actually happens. And even when they are there, Colin Farrell's character pretty much has to babysit them through everything, to the point where they're more of a hindrance than anything else. The comedy relief Snail and Slug are probably more helpful than they are. Normally with Chosen One characters, their uselessness is excused by the fact that they have something special about them that necessitates them being there in spite of everything. So, what exactly is so special about this girl? Well, she happens to know her father, and he happens to have the Chekhov's gun that saves the day at the end. I'm not kidding, that's seriously the only real impact she has on the plot. Also, Josh Hutcherson's character has no such excuse. I have no idea why he's even here. I don't even really have any positives to justify why it's ranked above the last three. The lows just didn't feel quite as low. Number 9. Rio 2. This movie just had way too much going on. That seems to be a pretty recurring issue with Blue Sky movies, having about 65 times more characters and subplots than they need to. There are a number of scenes in this movie that, in a vacuum, are fine, but nothing gets any development or focus because of all the other junk they've crammed in. A lot of the time, when it cuts back to a character we haven't seen in a while, it's a reminder that that character is even in the movie. And it really doesn't help that a fair amount of the characters and subplots that the focus has to be split between are just bad. It did not need a jealousy subplot. It did not need that bit where it randomly turns into a sports movie for 10 minutes. I guess the World Cup was in Brazil that year, so they wanted to tie that in somehow. It did not need the villain from the previous movie, and the massive chunk of screen time dedicated to his bizarre subplot with this frog that's hot for him. He's such a non-character in this one. Even the main cast react really nonchalantly when they realize it's him. Nonchalantly? Is that a word? So, what exactly causes it to rank higher than some of the other movies that I had similar problems with? Honestly, it's mostly the music and the animation. Those two things were great in the first Rio, and they're still great here. Beautiful Creatures is genuinely a fantastic song that I've gone back and listened to many times since I watched this. Basically, my one-sentence review for this movie is, pick a lane. Number 8. Ice Age, The Meltdown. Yeah, my ranking of the Ice Age movies is not in reverse series order. This is probably the Ice Age movie I've seen the most times, and yet it's consistently the one that I remember the least about. The Meltdown is easily the most uninteresting movie to come out of this franchise, because, for the most part, it's just the bog-standard, mediocre animated sequel, where it's largely just an exact repeat of the first movie, with the same three characters walking from point A to point B again, only this time they don't really have anything interesting going on between them because they've already had their arcs. So, what do they do to change up the formula a little bit? They give one of them a token love interest, probably about the most stock out of all stock sequel storylines out there. Maybe if it were at least a good romantic subplot, that would be fine, but it has to be one of the most awkward romances I've ever seen, and even if it was a good romance, that would still leave 2 of our 3 main characters without any actual role to play in the story. Diego and Sid are kinda just there the entire time. The meltdown is bad, but it's not even fascinatingly bad like 4 and 5 were, it's just really dull. Number 7. Ferdinand. You know, I was actually kind of into this one for parts of it, but that made the parts that didn't work feel a lot more disappointing. If I had one major overarching issue with Ferdinand, it's this. It seems like the movie desperately wants to be dark, but it's just too afraid to commit to it. The situation these characters are in is actually pretty bleak, and I would have quite liked it if they'd maybe leaned into that a little more. On paper, I do like the story of this movie, but in execution, aside from a few scenes, it's mostly just a standard, loud, kind of obnoxious kiddie affair, with a bunch of meme references that were probably already dated when the movie came out, nearly a decade ago now. Dabbing is like ancient superstition as far as internet trends go. I'm not saying a movie can't be both serious and funny. The problem is that, well, 1, it's very rarely successful in being funny, and 2, the more serious moments often feel straight up kneecapped. There was this one particular moment where they totally walk back on what would have been a pretty bold and effective character death for a movie like this, about 20 minutes after the fact. It doesn't even make sense within the context of the movie. Probably the best out of their subpar movies, but still subpar nonetheless. Number 6. Horton Hears a Who. I don't even know what approach I can possibly take with this one. For me, this is another one of those movies like Sponge Out of Water that largely gets by just on being really weird. It's a very strange mix of the movie being like 50% genuinely quite funny, 30% so awful that it's funny, 10% actually painfully unfunny, and then 10% the craziest shit you've ever seen. I mean, if I hadn't seen it before, I don't think I could have guessed that the other characters being a bit annoyed at Horton for talking to a flower would escalate into a full-on public crucifixion. It's not that easy a movie to critique, really. It's an adaptation of a Dr. Seuss book, which were always hyper-simplistic by design, and a lot of the humor kind of rides on the main actors doing their usual shtick. However you tend to feel about Jim Carrey and Steve Carell comedies in general is probably going to be a pretty good indicator of how you're going to feel about this movie. I do have to point out though, the dance party ending in this movie might actually be the single worst one of all time. What does the song "Can't Fight This Feeling" have to do with anything, and how do these characters from different planets both know it? Number 5. Rio. It's very similar to the second movie in many ways. Good music, nice dance animations, but with a lot less baggage. There isn't nearly as much of an overabundance of characters in this one, and the characters that are given focus tend to be considerably more likable and funny on average. The romance could be kind of cute at times, but I'm not gonna pretend I'm a massive fan of the male lead. I think Jesse Eisenberg is a bit too good at playing a pathetic wimp. In general, I kinda just think wimpy characters are annoying, alright? I previously had Blue marked as the wimpiest wimp out of all movie protagonists, but for this marathon, I happened to watch this right after Spies in Disguise, and suddenly he didn't seem as bad in comparison. He looks like a goddamn Giga Chad next to that kid. Number 4. Robots. I don't love robots, but I found it kind of interesting. Unlike, say, Pixar's Cars, this movie seems like it put some thought into how a world of anthropomorphic machine people would actually work. Sometimes, at least. I'll get a bit more into that in a minute, but they actually take the time to explain how they have child robots, how they grow, how medical insurance and healthcare works for them, how corporations leave the poor to die in the name of profit, you know, all that jazz. Parts of the story do feel kind of rushed over. Like, I almost missed that there was supposed to be a ticking time bomb element with the main character's father being sick, when in a story with this subject matter, I feel a plot point like that should be treated with some importance. But in general, it is kind of a cool way of putting that sort of commentary into a family movie. Aside from the pacing, probably the main place this movie falters for me would be the humor. Robin Williams' character could be a bit much, and generally, it was a bit too juvenile for my taste. I mean, there's an entire character named Aunt Fanny whose only purpose is having a giant butt and farting a lot. And it's like, they're robots, how does that even make sense? And no, acknowledging that it doesn't make sense doesn't automatically make it funny. Okay, there was one fart joke that I thought was kinda funny because of how ridiculously over the top it was, but the rest of them, eh. Number 3. The Peanuts movie. This feels like a pretty great example of how to modernize a classic animated property without completely abandoning its identity. For one, unlike many of the other modern reboots that exist, this one is actually still animated, and it makes great use of the capped frame rate animation style, well before that style was even all that popular, to emulate the look of the classic 60s shorts and comic strips. Also, Charlie Brown himself is a simple but really likable protagonist in this. There were a lot of moments where the movie easily could have turned into a generic liar revealed or lose yourself in pursuit of whatever sort of story, but every time he decides by himself to do the right thing, even at his own expense. And everyone needs a friend like Linus in this movie. The bit near the end where Charlie is confused why the girl he likes chose to be his pen pal, and Linus just bluntly says,
"Charlie Brown, it might be time to consider the wild possibility that you're a good person and that people like you."
That moment's great. I do think structurally the movie is a bit repetitive, and the ending, while sweet, does also have a character kind of just blatantly list out all of the movie's themes, but this is still easily my favorite thing Blue Sky has done outside of their flagship series. Speaking of, numbers 2 and 1. The two good Ice Age movies, the original and the third one, Dawn of the Dinosaurs. With how much the series was eventually run into the ground, it can be kind of easy to forget that, on its own, the first Ice Age movie was just a great, classic road trip comedy. The dynamic between the main trio is hilarious, and Diego has one of cinema's definitive redemption arcs. As for number 3, most people seem to be of the opinion that the Ice Age movies only get worse with each subsequent entry, but I am a staunch defender of Dawn of the Dinosaurs. This is pretty much the only movie in the series besides the original where it feels like all of the main characters actually have an arc and an interesting role to play in the story. Buck makes for a really fun addition to the main cast, and this is easily the one with the best scrat sequences. Also, something I haven't mentioned yet is that the score is actually pretty great throughout all of the Ice Age movies, even the bad ones. There's not too much in it, but on this most recent rewatch, I did find the third one does take a little bit to get really good, and while I genuinely love most of the movie, there are a few select moments where my enjoyment is partially ironic. So for those reasons, I think the first movie wins out. I'll reiterate, I have a video, and an upcoming updated version of that video, where I get into my thoughts on these movies and this whole series in a lot more detail. But basically, if you've never seen any of the Ice Age movies and are thinking about checking them out, these are pretty much the only two you need to watch. Plus Scrat Tales. Scrat Tales is good. There's one more movie that's often brought up when discussing Blue Sky, that I wound up leaving off the ranking because I'm not really sure it counts, and that movie is Nimona. This movie started production under Blue Sky, however, the studio was shut down before the film could be completed, and it didn't come out until over 2 years after Blue Sky ceased to be. People often go around saying, of course it counts, the director said it was about 75% complete before the studio closed, and that figure is not accurate. What the director actually said is that it was 70% the way through layout. The layout basically being a really rough animatic that serves as a step in between storyboarding and proper animation. I'm probably hypersimplifying this explanation, but I'm sure you get the approximate idea from the visuals you're seeing. A lot of work had been done on this movie under Blue Sky, but it was absolutely nowhere near completion. And in the end, it was not officially released under their name, so Regardless, I will talk about this movie properly when I eventually do my ranking of every movie nominated for Best Animated Feature. Not to bring up this point yet again, but I can't exactly do my usual future projects segment for this studio when they don't exist anymore. I guess I could mention the things that Disney is planning on doing with the series they used to make. It's been announced that Ice Age is going to get another sequel, and there's some fringe discussion that maybe Rio will get one as well. Not that Ice Age had a perfect track record under Blue Sky, but we've already seen what it looks like when a studio that isn't them tries to do something with this property. I am curious to see how this'll turn out, but my hopes aren't exactly high. The next 4 big videos I make are probably going to be the remastered versions of my Ice Age retrospective, as well as my DreamWorks, Disney, and Pixar rankings. And the next new studio I plan on covering for this series will be Studio Ghibli, so be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for that, and leave your thoughts on Blue Sky and my ranking in the comments below. Thanks for watching, goodbye.